Alex Simikov. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at Policy Exchange. We are the UK's foremost public policy research institute with a focus on practical policy implementations to achieve and advance Britain's prosperity. We are pleased today to present a very distinguished panel to talk about cheap, clean and green and the future of British energy. When we had first started planning this panel early in the summer, we asked ourselves what would happen if Vladimir Putin cut off the gas. Today we know the answer. It's the worst energy crisis in my lifetime, and one that can get much worse. A crisis that is not just one of energy, but specifically one of fossil fuels, where now wind energy costs 9 times less than natural gas-fired generation. Never before has energy security and net zero aligned as strongly as it does today. Today we have a very distinguished panel of guests to discuss what these issues mean for the UK, and how we can seize the opportunities moving forward. To my right, we have seated Nusrat Ghani, the Minister of State for Business, Energy, Innovation and Strategy. She's also the MP for Wealden in East Sussex, and very proudly, a daughter of Birmingham herself. To my right, further, is Ben Houchin, the Mayor of Tees Valley since 2017. Last year, he was re-elected with 73% of the vote, and we're very happy to have him. To my left, first we have Angie Needle. She's the Director of Strategy for Cadent Gas, as well as serving as Vice President of Hydrogen UK. We have Claire Jackson, the Chief Executive Officer of Hydrogen UK, who are very generous sponsors in making this panel possible. So thank you kindly for your time and support. To her left, we have David Blackman, who is the Policy Correspondent for Utility Week. Thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to start with you, Minister of State. Has been a very exciting time for your ministry, has certainly gone through a tremendous amount of change and a tremendous challenge before you. What have you learned from the crisis, and how has that affected your view on net zero and Britain's steps to achieve our climate and energy security objectives?
Well, thank you, Alex, for the introduction. It's very important I reconfirm I am a Brummie, because I know it makes people very happy here in Birmingham to hear that. My view is also formed not from just being in the department, and I must put on record I'm not actually the energy minister, so hopefully what I'm saying isn't going to be new policy, and this is for the journalists on the panel with us today, but it's more hopefully of a discussion. But look, I've been on the BEIS Select Committee for a couple of years, and many of you would have seen the reports published by BEIS, and I also sat on NATO's Science and Tech Committee for a couple of years as well, so hopefully my view stems from the research and the evidence that was presented to us. Fundamentally, I believe that we cannot be in a situation ever again where Putin or anyone like Putin can hold us hostage over our energy supply. So my focus would be in the department doing what I can to support the ministers to ensure that we have better resilience, better access, better transportation of clean energy, and ensuring that we're never in a situation, as I mentioned earlier, that we are held hostage. I just wanted to quickly speak about some of the things that the government is doing, if I may. Because of the situation that we're in, we've had to put together a £60 billion package to make sure we're taking care of people up and down the country as well as businesses, and that's obviously a very costly endeavour, which is why we have to make sure that we're planning and investing in energy, making sure we're resilient going forward. And it, as a minister, no longer on the Business Select Committee, I cannot be as free as I'd want to be, so I need to make sure that I'm closer to the government's position, more so than the position that I had when I was involved in writing the report on energy for the BEIS committee, which I would encourage everybody in this room to read. But look, about 18 months ago, we did have Ofgem and others come and give evidence to the Select Committee to try and encourage them to become more resilient, and obviously that didn't take place. So there is an issue for us to deal with, these bodies that are meant to be managing our supply and the producers of supply, and also those that are distributing it as well. I just want to draw on the government's energy security strategy, which was on the 7th of April, which talked about rising global energy prices and the volatility in international markets, and the government's commitment to supercharge clean energy and accelerate deployment, which will see 95% of Great Britain's electricity to be low carbon by 2030. I think the government's commitments are pretty solid when it comes to the net zero agenda, and hopefully with a new legislation or new direction that we're taking, there'll be much more confidence that we'll have much more resilience in our supply chain as well. I'm anxious to say much more because I know Ben's doing a huge amount of work on Teesside, especially on hydrogen alternative fuels too, and that matters a lot to your part of the world. I'm not sure what more I can add at the moment. I'm just keen to try and answer some Q&As. I'm anxious if I say too much, you'll just say it's a new direction, new policy, when it's not in my portfolio, to be honest. But I'm happy to take Q&As later on.
Wonderful, thank you. Mr. Mayor, what is the view on the net zero transition from Tees Valley, and in particular, how can we ensure that all parts of Britain can benefit from the energy transition, both in terms of decarbonizing and creating the economic opportunities for manufacturing and installation to make sure that your constituents can thrive as well as those in the southeast?
Well, one of the very liberalising things of being a mayor rather than a government minister or in Parliament is that I can say whatever I want and I don't have to set government policy, and people can say that I'm crazy and it's got nothing to do with us. So I tend to just kind of shoot from the hip. But I think Teesside is a really interesting example, and thank you to the Minister for saying that we're doing a huge amount. And actually the test bed actually I think is happening in Teesside with the most advanced cluster. I think when you look at a number of different technologies, whether that's carbon capture and storage with decarbonised gas, whether it's the projects from BP in blue and green hydrogen, gigawatt by 2026, the full 2 gigawatts by 2030, whether that then links into some fantastic technologies around, for example, decarbonised LPG, which again is going largely unnoticed for gas in the homes off the grid. And then what we haven't talked about much in Teesside is how those types of technologies go much, much further than not just energy generation into homes, not just into industry, but into things like sustainable aviation fuel. And there's some really interesting technology that is far exceeding government regulation at the minute, where there are, particularly from the US, businesses looking to produce large-scale sustainable aviation fuel plants, not using waste, but going directly to hydrogen feedstock and carbon feedstock, which you would naturally base in somewhere like Teesside, when you're capturing carbon from industry and you're producing large-scale amounts of hydrogen through the electrolyzers and the blue hydrogen sources. There's a real ecosystem that can be built up around Teesside. Now, the transition is really, really important in that context. So we've got a great story. We've got all ends of the scale because of the history we have in ICI as the world's first modern chemical plant built in 1947 that gives us we're in a very lucky position as a consequence of history that we're inheriting a lot of those assets that can be repurposed and the skills can be reapplied in a 21st century economy. But transition is just that, it's a transition. And we always have to bear in mind that if we move too quickly and we move too abruptly, then that can have unintended consequences where we lose the community and we lose taking the public along with us on that journey. And it's something that I've said for a couple of years now to try and demonstrate it. It's quite a flippant anecdote, but it's worth encapsulating what that means in a place like Teesside, because actually Teesside's done very well in cutting its carbon emissions over the last 5 to 10 years. But it's a very easy thing to cut your carbon emissions in half when you close the steelworks and put 3,500 people out of work. And it's a really clear demonstration that there are big industries still in Teesside. We're still the second largest carbon emitting region in the country next to the Humber because of the chemical and processing industry that we have, that the transition isn't just about new energy sources and new feedstocks for the future, it's also about protecting existing industry that we have today. And I need to look and remind government that actually there are 5,500 people employed directly in the chemical and processing industry in Teesside. And unless we do something about decarbonising energy, gas in particular, that actually those jobs won't exist in 20 years' time. And we know what happens when thousands of people are put out of work in post-industrial communities and the impact that has on communities, on complex social and family issues. And that's the issue that we need to address. So transition isn't just about cost, because invariably that comes down to cost and the uptake in the private sector of being able to produce something cost efficiently and therefore being able to provide it to the public at an affordable rate. It's also about taking the community along with you. Now, in a place like Teesside, it's very easy for us to do that because the way that we start that is we set a narrative and we create a community feel that takes them along with us. And it's much easier in a place like Teesside to do that because that's where a lot of the assets are going to be based, right? It's where Net Zero Teesside are going to build a $4 billion, 1 gigawatt gas-fired power plant with carbon capture on the side of it. It's where, like I say, BP are going to invest hundreds of millions of pounds in hydrogen. It's where SEA and South Korean company are building the world's largest monopile factory for offshore wind. It's where the landing for Dogger Bank and most of the energy coming from offshore wind in the North Sea is coming right into Redcar. So we're very, very fortunate. So the way that we can frame it is through jobs and investment. And actually the consequence of a decarbonised grid being able to have energy security in the future to a lot of people in Teesside is a good secondary benefit, but the primary benefit is one of community pride, its manufacturing, its industry, and its income and its higher wages, which is really, really important. And then the very final point, as an opening for me, is that we also have to recognise, albeit we are a free market economy and we absolutely should not be turning our back on the rest of the world, that geopolitical events can have a major effect. And actually net zero, as well as helping level up large parts of the country, helping deliver a Conservative majority at the next general election because of the jobs and investment that we create, if we can take renewables and our sustainable energy sources from 40% to even higher that we're now at, and if we can reduce our reliance on natural gas, which is currently around 40%, if we can get that down to anywhere between 10 and 20%, we're obviously going to be impacted by global gas prices, but much less so. And renewables is an easier way to be able to transition to sustainable fuels, but also that are indigenously generated in the UK, which helps insulate us to some extent from international headwinds. So this is essential, not just from an economic perspective, from an electoral perspective, but from a geopolitical perspective as well.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Angie, there's a lot of opportunities about jobs of the future, but today the fossil fuel industry, from upstream exploration to downstream boiler installations, employs over 1 million people across the UK. What is Cadent's view on the energy transition for those workers, and how do we make sure that they're part of that transition as well?
Great, thank you. Good question. So the energy transition is obviously very important for those who work in the oil and gas sector today. Cadent is a large gas distributor. We manage around 132,000 kilometres of gas pipes across half the country, delivering natural gas to 11 million homes and businesses. And actually, we provide gas to this wonderful city of Birmingham. So our network engineers are out there making sure that the energy keeps flowing. But we know, of course, that we've got to move away from natural gas as quickly as possible. And we've been working hard on what our role is in providing some of those alternatives, which is going to create those jobs in the future. And I'll talk to you a little bit about our work on hydrogen in a moment. And I know that times are difficult now, right, for people. We've got the cost of living crisis, we've got the war in Ukraine, the instability caused by COVID, and it's made it really clear just how much global issues are felt domestically. And it's become ever apparent that energy security in particular and energy resilience should be much higher on the agenda. And I'm glad that we can bring both net zero and energy security together in this conversation. Previously, complex models have been put together as to how we can achieve net zero, of course, created by the Committee on Climate Change and other great institutions. And they've generally assumed that global markets will just step in and help out when we need it. The interconnectors with Europe will just provide electricity and gas when we're short of supply, that global markets will provide cheaper commodities like heat pumps and plentiful labour, and this just simply is not going to be the case. We're going to have to very much rely on homegrown energy, homegrown innovation, homegrown jobs and skills, and we're going to need everything on the table to get to net zero. And my fear actually is that the energy policies today don't really think about people and the reality of what needs to be achieved. Heck, we can't even roll out smart meters into everybody's homes. And we're putting a lot of pressure on households right now. We're assuming that everybody can buy a heat pump, which is currently marketing about £13,000 a go. And incidentally, this is the same as the average savings in the bank of people in the West Midlands. So we're asking people to spend their life savings on a new heating system. And by the way, 1 in 4 have only got £1,000 in the bank. Right? And it's pretty drastic. So with this in mind, it's simply not going to happen with wishful thinking. We really need to be much more creative about how we're going to encourage both switching to energy efficiency and switching fuel sources and a range of different technologies to get to net zero. So obviously I'm going to talk about hydrogen now. We've been looking at gas networks for a while, making sure that it is both compatible with a potential switch to hydrogen, and that's pure hydrogen. So we've been looking at the gas networks. Can we just, rather than we don't need to replace the gas network, everybody, you can put hydrogen in there. We've been looking at what that looks like in people's homes too. We've demonstrated the viability with very few modifications. And with that in mind, we've also been focusing very closely on projects like HyNet, which is a big industrial decarbonisation scheme in the northwest, I will raise Ben Houchen's 1 gigawatt and match it for a similar 1 gigawatt. So we've got like lots of potential to create jobs and skills in the northwest and the northeast in relation to hydrogen production, carbon capture and storage. And we've got industries lined up, you know, who want that hydrogen that will bring the jobs into the UK. Companies like Hanson's and Pilkington's, Ensert and Kellogg's, they find it very difficult to think of other solutions other than hydrogen. But switching to low carbon gas is one of the simplest things that we can do to heat our homes in the future, especially those already on gas and those homes that have got high costs to electrify. Remember, we're keeping all options on the table. And the gas network today, we forget, delivers 9 times the amount of electricity, 9 times the amount of energy as the electricity network in the middle of winter. And it's designed for a 1 in 20 winter. So when it's really cold outside, the gas network steps in and helps out. And that's quite key when we come and think about the different things that we need to do to work together. Gas networks are quite resilient. It's like one big straw. It doesn't have lots of moving parts. And I do worry that we're making things a little bit complicated. Very few of you will have ever had a gas cut. And if you had, it's because somebody's chopped through one of our pipes, actually. But the beauty is in its simplicity. It doesn't require complex changes to homes, smart meters, batteries, complex kit and equipment, demand-side response. It just needs a new boiler, which is why we're really pleased that government are taking hydrogen as an option seriously for all its uses, not just home heating, of course. Supporting trials of hydrogen conversion. We've got plans for a hydrogen village coming up in Whitby in the north west. I know there's 2 Whitbys, right? This is the northwest Whitby, and a town on hydrogen by 2030. And government are getting ready, thinking about how we mandate hydrogen boilers so that people have got choices in their homes. Now, I know many of you will ask where all this hydrogen is going to come from, and it's why we're not suggesting a like-for-like swap for hydrogen with natural gas. It's not possible. Right? We need to work together with heat pumps and district heating schemes so that you've got a solution for every single home. And more importantly, we've got a reliable and resilient energy supply for the country. It's going to take everything we've got, I think. Cheers.
Thank you, Angie. Claire, you serve as CEO as the voice of the hydrogen sector in the UK. I understand you guys have come forward with a new set of plans to call on this government to take action to help deliver the promise of hydrogen energy. Can you speak a little bit more about those ideas?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, firstly, I'd just like to say what a revelation that 5 p.m. is officially the point where you can get a drink in this town. So please do all drink up. My hope is that the more you drink, the more intelligent I will sound. But yeah, so my name is Claire. I run Hydrogen UK. We are the industry association for hydrogen. We bring together all of the organisations that are really excited about the role that hydrogen can play and are committed to making the UK the very best place in the whole world to do hydrogen. I just want to talk a little bit about why we're really excited about hydrogen and why we think it plays an absolutely critical part in our future. And the first is that the economic growth of this country moving forward will be predicated on the availability of clean, affordable, reliable energy. And it turns out that there's large parts of our energy system that it's just not possible to do that for in the future without hydrogen. So there's lots of part of our energy system you just can't electrify. So Angie's talked about a few of those in sort of heavy industry. You know, if you're looking to make steel, chemicals, cement, you're looking auto manufacturing, you just can't electrify those kinds of things. So we're going to need hydrogen. And similarly, sort of heavy-duty transport. You know, if you want to decarbonize maritime, aviation, big trucks that if you put a battery in, you lose half the payload. Hydrogen's a really great option for those. And actually, if we can make hydrogen available, it will make UK industry competitive, and it will also make the UK a really great place for industries to come into. The second reason why hydrogen is really important is because energy security is really, really important. I think unless you've been living under a rock for the last year or so, you'll have noticed we've got a little bit of an energy security issue on our hands at the moment, which means that we need to be deploying domestic renewables as fast as is humanly possible. The challenge that we have there is around matching that supply and demand. So at the moment, we're spending about £1.5 billion a year on managing that supply and demand curve. That's about 3 times more than it was a couple of years ago. And if we want to continue to deploy new renewables onto our grid, we need to do that alongside some sort of mechanism which is able to store and transport that energy. Turns out, hydrogen is a really, really great option for that. So if we want to deploy more renewables, we need to deploy hydrogen alongside it to make the economics work. And the third reason why hydrogen is a really interesting opportunity is because of the economic opportunity. Hydrogen is a huge growth sector globally. It's estimated it will be worth about $2.5 trillion by 2050 and responsible for millions and millions of jobs. And we want to make sure a large slice of that pie ends up in the UK. But that will only happen if we are a leader and not a follower. And the UK is in a great position. You know, we have projects here which are genuinely world-leading, are very, very exciting projects. We've got amazing technology developers here, and we've developed some really world-leading policies that will get these projects kick-started and off the ground. But at the moment, we're still at that pre-kickoff moment, and it's so important that we take that next stage and we are a leader and not a follower. So, how do we make sure that we're a leader and not a follower? I'm so glad you asked. Now, we've been doing some thinking around that at Hydrogen UK, looking at different parts of the value chain and how do we accelerate this next phase of hydrogen's growth. And that's why on your seats today, you've got a lovely little document called Hydrogen Accelerators, which starts to answer some of those questions. And part of that is to do with making sure that these different parts of the value chain, production, the enabling infrastructure, and the demand side sectors are all coming together at the same point and becoming available at the same time. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that document. If you're online and you don't have a hard copy on your chair, then you can find that on our socials or on our website. But there's one thing I want to say just to sort of preface a little bit of this, is that none of this is any good if we don't get this energy bill through Parliament. So the hydrogen business models, which is all the policy that we've been working on for the last 3 years, is the policies which are going to kick-start those very early stage projects and kick-start hydrogen in the UK. At the moment, that energy policy has been paused, and that is hugely concerning to an industry that not only is ready to go and has the investment lined up, but is also now finding that there's other economies that are catching up. The US's Inflation Reduction Act, which I always want to call the IRA, but it confuses people terribly when I call it that. Joe Biden would approve. And similarly, France and Germany are all putting significant funding on the table. And we are in a competitive race here to find out who is going to come out first, where are those jobs going to go, who is going to emerge as a leader. And if we do not continue and push forward with the plans that we have in place, investment will go elsewhere. So as I said, industry is ready to deliver. It's a really, really exciting prospect. We need it, but we need to make sure that we're pulling the trigger now and not pulling the plug. Thank you.
Thank you, Ange. David, you work for Utility Week. You're a journalist. You're an industry leader in terms of analyzing what the sector views on these. What is your view of some of the promises that are being and ambitions expressed on stage? Where do you think we're going to take it from here?
Yeah, well, thanks very much to the Policy Exchange for the invitation, and please forgive me if I have a 1,000-yard stare. This is my second party conference in a trot in successive weeks. So also delighted to be back in Birmingham, where I started my first job in journalism in the summer of 1994 at the Solihull Times. I conducted a little thought experiment. Where were we nearly 30 years ago with energy? What was the generation mix? And base statistics show that coal made up just over half, nuclear nearly 30%, gas around a seventh of the generation mix, and wind and solar, zilch. Contrast that to the figures that were produced by Nusrat's department last week. Quarterly figures, they show that renewables contributed around 38% of the generation mix, fossil fuels just ahead on 41%. These statistics also show the UK became a net exporter of electricity for the first time since 2010. So things have changed really hugely on the generation side. In terms of the I suppose what we still call the growth plan. Something that didn't get much attention on the day, perhaps unsurprisingly, was the government's move to relax planning rules for wind farms. Previously, they were about the most difficult thing you could get consent for any kind of development, which seemed odd to say the least at a time when onshore renewables offer perhaps the cheapest and swiftest route to delivering new generation and therefore energy security. So I think that was massively welcomed from within the industry. I'd add a caveat though, like other moves to relax planning, let's see how it gets on in Parliament, because we know there's a lot of resistance, particularly amongst sort of Conservative backbench MPs to a lot of these moves around planning. So, yeah, there's going to be a really important role for gas going forward, particularly during the transition. Regarding hydrogen for heat, yes, probably. I mean, I think the industry, the gathering view, the consensus view within the industry that it's going to have for heat, it's going to have a role, but perhaps a more limited one than electricity, perhaps concentrated regionally. But it will have green hydrogen. It has, as Claire was saying, a massively important role in sort of in evening out those sort of peaks and flows that you have on the electricity system. What the Germans call, I think, the Dunkelflotte. And also, crucially, it probably has a more important role to play than nuclear. I know nuclear is getting a lot of headlines at the moment, but nuclear provides sort of safe and steady, reliable generation. Whereas what we're probably going to need in the future, we're going to have these big gaps, these weeks at a time, when we're getting hardly any electricity generation. At that point, green hydrogen is going to have a hugely important role. I would like, though, to also say that give a bit of a shout out to the kind of the less glamorous work around the transmission and distribution systems, so that we can better harness all this renewable electricity we're going to be creating, so that at those times of maximum generation, we don't have to turn off the wind farms when the wind is blowing hard, which of course annoys everyone so much and has already been noted on the panel, costs us an awful lot of money. Of course, I doubt whether many politicians are that keen to pose in a hard hat next to a new substation, and transmission can be politically contentious too, as colleagues here from, if there are any colleagues here from East Anglia, will be able to attest. But it's really key. In a similar key, I'd like to give a shout out for demand reduction, a theme that's emerged in quite a lot of the fringe sessions we've had at this conference. Energy efficiency, clearly a no-brainer. We should have been doing a lot more of it over the last decade. However, if we're talking about this winter, getting people to adjust their demand can deliver much more immediate and tangible results, because you're not going to get the lagging done for this winter. You're not even going to be able to build an onshore wind farm. You're certainly not going to build a nuclear power station. So it seems, I think there's been a sort of a certain amount of puzzlement on the fringe this week, or the energy fringe anyway, about why the government seems to sort of reluctant to contemplate the kind of public information campaigns that would get us to moderate our energy consumption, and which would also have big knock-on consequences in terms of reducing the strain on peak time energy supplies. This winter across Western Europe, we face potentially the gravest and most immediate threat to our collective security since World War II. I would suggest that perhaps we need some blitz spirit to help get us through this crisis, and a few public information campaigns would be a really good start. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We'd like to go to the floor from questions. In particular, our Minister of State has to leave in about 50 minutes to, and I'm not exaggerating, to save lives of women and children. So if we
in
could,
Afghanistan.
in Afghanistan, not in the UK, in Afghanistan. So we appreciate her time as well. If you could please start by identifying your name and place of work as well. Please do make this a question and not a statement. We'd greatly appreciate it. We have a roving mic. We'd like a statement here from the front, and the gentleman in the back. Claire.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Jordanis Chantafilu. I have a question about jobs and sort of timescale. If you create 5,000 jobs, but you also lose another 5,000 jobs, then overall you've created 0 jobs. You've just moved jobs around the country. So as we move towards hydrogen and create all these jobs that we need in hydrogen, wind and solar, if we're also moving away from gas, coal, oil, aren't we going to be losing those jobs? So how can we make sure that overall those people aren't left in the cold, literally and metaphorically, and there are jobs for all around?
Thank you.
Hello, James from Cooperatives UK. It seems that we're going to need to pull together private investment, community investment, and some public money to deploy renewables at scale. I wonder what the panel's views are on the potential for joint ventures at a regional level of community investors, private investors, and public authorities who potentially can borrow at lower rates and can also have huge convening power locally to develop renewables.
Minister, could we start with you on the job creation?
That's a very valuable question. Thank you so much. I mean, there is huge anxiety about reskilling people, especially in communities that they feel that some of the old industries are being left behind for renewables. The government has put together a Green Jobs Task Force, and that's developing an action plan to support 2 million good quality green jobs and the skills that we need by 2030. Otherwise, we're just going to fall behind the opportunities that are coming this way with renewable energy. So there is a short and a long-term strategy in place. I know when I was maritime and HS2 minister, the thing that slowed the projects down most of all was actually getting hold of skilled workforce. What helped most of all was working with fantastic companies that were prepared to invest in their workers to try and reskill. Unfortunately, it's not always government, the Department for Education that can get that right. So we'll obviously have to be leaning on the sector, but at the same time, we have a budget in place, a 12 billion 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, and that of course will involve reskilling as well. There's huge opportunity in renewables, and we're just going to have to make sure that those opportunities remain in those parts of the country where those renewable energies are taking place, so we just don't draw them in to clusters around London, Oxford and Cambridge. Do you want me to respond to public-private partnerships as well? I'm a bit anxious. I'm trying not to reply as someone that was on the Business Select Committee, but someone who's now a minister within the department. But the projects that I came across when I was on the Select Committee that worked really well were public-private partnerships, especially if they were delivered very locally by my council, for example, or by Ben. I think there's nothing worse than people in SW1 making decisions for people like Ben and the leaders of my council. So I think that will be incredibly useful. I'm hoping that the new enterprise zones will be a really neat way of enabling local public-private partnerships take place and for the wealth that's generated to remain in those areas as well.
Mayor, what do you see for the public, the investment zones? Are you excited about those? Do you have any anxieties?
No, I'm excited by them, but I would say that because I also helped design them. So, I mean, the investment zones are in effect supercharging the free port policy that we had in the previous administration. So the tax benefits or the cuts that come with investment zones are the same ones. They've added a little bit on SDLT for residential exemptions as well, but they go a lot further. So, you know, the business rates holiday, the employer's national insurance contribution holiday goes a lot further. But actually, if you're a profitable business and you're making a reasonable number of, you know, size profit, then actually you can start building some pretty substantial things with an investment zone, and it's a tax write-off within 5 years. It really does start to get things going, and it de-risks it from, you know, a commercial development or an industrial development point of view, because you can even do some of these at greater risk because you're not having to get the rates liability as well, because you know you've got 10 years to be able to feel it out. The really interesting thing where investment zones went that Freeport's never really went, albeit you could do some local development order stuff, was around the simplification of the planning process. And you know, where that seems to be landing, and the detail will come out in a bit more detail very shortly, so I can only give you the broad brush for you, but it seems to be the government are landing on a zone where within an investment zone you have more, well, something that's not the same but more akin to an American style zoning system. So where you have a local plan in place for, say, a large industrial style, like former steelworks in Teesside, that is, you know, suitable for large-scale energy generation, manufacturing and logistics, then actually there is a presumption that you can just get on and develop as long as you're developing in line with the local plan. So being able to, in some cases, shave 18 months, 2 years off the development of a project, which often a lot of major manufacturers and producers put in place. One of the things I pitched to government, and they were very interested in it, but I think it's actually quite a difficult thing to be able to change, is that I do think where you have devolved mayors, one really interesting devolved power, which would be much more beneficial in places like Teesside necessarily than Sevenoaks in the southeast, would be where you could insert a mayoral authority decision in, for example, the DCO process. Because in places like Teesside, the DCO actually slows things down. And I know it's there to be able to arguably, push through nationally significant projects. But in a place like Teesside, there are a number of energy projects we would sign off locally and be able to push through. And we kind of felt that maybe the ability to insert local approval, which government are quite keen on things not just on planning, but also on things like shale gas, etc., where there's something quite neat about introducing an approval from a regional directly elected mayor that could help with that. So the investment zones will supercharge investment, but obviously not just around industry and energy generation. I think they're going to do a whole load of things. And I don't buy the argument, with the greatest respect, around moving jobs around. I mean, it's an issue that people have to face, and we need to make sure that, not that we move jobs around, because the Luddites have been saying that for centuries, haven't we, with the introduction of new technologies. The issue we have, and again, Teesside's a great example of this, is that we know that the jobs are coming. So you can see Net Zero Teesside, BP, SEA, other offshore wind manufacturers, lots of other stuff going on. And it's not just in renewables, it's in all sorts of new and emerging industries. The issue is that we need to make sure that local people are skilled for them, because we'll fill the jobs, right? There'll be people from across the country that will come in and take the jobs. But what we need is, again, it goes back to that community cohesion point, actually, where you've got large levels of deprivation in places like Teesside and in the industrial clusters that tend to be located in post-industrial areas with high unemployment, deprivation, poverty, etc. They don't have the right skill set. And this isn't about foreign labour, this is about, little Jane who lives in Redcar, who can see the development happening across the road, but for whatever reason the mechanisms aren't in place to make sure that she has the ability to, get a graduate position or become an apprentice. And we see people from Manchester or Birmingham or London moving up and taking those jobs, but actually not helping to relieve some of the community pressures that we have. That, I think, on the skill side is more of a pressing issue for us. But fundamentally, it's not just in the energy sector. I mean, if you look at Net Zero Teesside, for instance, we've got to talk about the skills that they deliver once it's built. But at their peak construction, which is in about 2 years' time, assuming they start in Q1 next year, their peak construction estimate is 5,000 construction workers. If somebody can tell me where I can find 5,000 construction workers in the northeast, never mind Teesside, it's just not going to happen, especially when we're getting into things like the future stages of HS2 and other infrastructure projects. It's about the whole supply chain life cycle of skills that we need to be much more flexible on. The mayoral point of view is that you could devolve a lot of DFE funding, post-16 education, where you start to match skills training with the jobs that are coming in your local area that could help to be able to address some of those things. Boot camps are a bit of a start, but are a bit clunky. There's a lot more that can be done. But no, and I also go to just very quickly on the point on public-private partnerships. Again, we're already doing that. I mean, one of the abilities that we've been able to do with this setting up of the development corporation in the former Redcar Steelworks is we knew, because we had only so much money from government, that we had to bring in the private sector to work with us. And actually, the private sector partners we have are absolutely incredible, and we wouldn't have got anywhere near as far without bringing in that private sector expertise than doing it ourselves. But at the same time, we bring something to the party by being part of local government with connections to local government that the private sector could never bring. And they can work very, very powerfully, and it is working extremely well in our part of the world.
Anything to add? We can go back to the floor. Fella in the blue tie and the pink tie as well.
Thank you very much. So I'm Philip White. I'm the Deputy Leader of Staffordshire County Council. And Staffordshire is approximately half of what we like to call the hydrogen manufacturing valley. Other people call it the A50 corridor, where we're lucky enough to have Rolls-Royce, Alstom, JCB, Toyota, all of whom will sell you various things that go, that are using hydrogen, in Rolls' case, developing those things to go. We've also, at Keele University in Staffordshire, got the high deploy demonstrator for putting hydrogen into the national grid. My question is around the value chain, because we've talked a lot today about energy generation, decarbonising, which is really important. But in our part of the world, we're really interested in that. We're also really interested in the opportunities in manufacturing and exporting. And not wishing to ask Nusrat to make policy on the hoof, but we're really interested in government's attitude towards investment in unlocking some of the blockers to that, as well as in decarbonising the energy system generally. Thank you.
And gentleman in the pink tie.
Guy Senior from Battersea, and I'm actually sitting next to Jane from Redcar.
See you again.
And I must admit I live in a solar-powered house. But what I wanted was just a little bit of education from someone on the panel, just to explain how we can produce hydrogen in a green way without using an awful lot of energy or carbon to actually get it produced.
Thank you. Folks, questions on the supply chains?
Can I do the first one? Please do. Run out of time. It's lovely to meet you. Hopefully, I was just going to say one of the department advisors was in the room, but they've just disappeared. I wanted to make sure they got hold of your card. Oh, Pete, he stood up right at the back. So make sure you make contact before you go. Look, you're in the right business. The government's already announced £240 million for the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund and for hydrogen production projects, for this year. And the industry is going to be booming. It's going to be worth £900 million, creating over 9,000 high-quality jobs by 2030. So it's the absolute perfect sector to be in. If we haven't done enough work to make sure that the supply chain is resilient and accessible to you, then I need to spend more time, as does Graham. I take care of critical supply chains, critical mineral supply chains, and there was a report that came out in the department about 6 months ago. Because of my work on the Business Select Committee, you'll understand some of my ideology and perspectives, and I want the policy to be refreshed. I think that's the appropriate word. And I'm worried that journalist is going to say I'm going to be rewriting it, but I'm not. But I'm hoping that report will make it a little bit easier for you to see some clarity and transparency in supply chains, because I don't want it to be academic. I want to understand what industry needs and how we can get those critical minerals transported to them in a resilient way. So please hand your card to Pete, and I'll be in touch. Thank you.
Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question on value chains is really important, because we've been doing I'm talking about hydrogen, of course, but it's the same regardless of what kind of energy vector system you're talking about. You look at a bit of it and then you go, okay, well, we've solved that bit. What bit do we need to do next? And so we've got some really good projects that are looking at the end-to-end, and the hydrogen village that we're planning is actually a good example of that, because we've got to bring together boiler manufacturers of hydrogen boilers, meters, heat pumps too, right? Because we'll be converting those who don't want to take part into electric solutions. We've got, the conversion of the gas network, we've got the production of hydrogen, we've got to have all that in one place in time to do a conversion in one go. So you've got like some real life end-to-end value chain projects that are going on that can really bring this together, because it's not just about the supply of kit and equipment, it's about skills and labour as well that we talked about. It's about, I could talk about skills and labour a little bit, but I think the key thing is making sure that we start now to plan for there. And we're very good at, looking at next year, but actually I'm thinking about what happens in 10 years' time and what manufacturing do we need there and how do we join those things together. I also think we've got a massive global opportunity to be the manufacturer of stuff for the world in the energy transition sector. And I think that's something that we ought to really focus on accelerating. It's really key for us.
Well, I mean, if I perhaps take the question on hydrogen production, I guess just very basic crash course in hydrogen production. There are many, many ways to make hydrogen in a low carbon fashion, but they broadly fall into two categories, some around the edges. One is a process called electrolysis, which takes electricity from renewables or nuclear and uses it to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. And the other is where you take natural gas and you split it into carbon and hydrogen, and then you store the carbon underground. But we're probably a little bit less interested in the production methodology at the moment. I think what we're interested in is two things. One is, how do we ensure that it is genuinely low carbon, what it is that we're doing, and how do we make it affordable? And so one of the things that we've developed over the last couple of years in the UK, which is hugely important, is a low carbon hydrogen standard, which means that we can be confident that any molecule that enters our energy system in the future will be genuinely low carbon. So that's hugely important for us, and that's something that is, again, globally world-leading, really important. And the second is around affordability. So getting the cost of production of hydrogen down is one of the sort of key targets and key missions of the industry at the moment. And I guess I just want to encourage you that I would say hydrogen is a little bit like where offshore wind was 10 years ago, where costs were high, we invested, and the cost came shooting down. I think, if you'd said 10 years ago what the cost of offshore wind would be now, everyone would have laughed you out of the room. And we're expecting hydrogen to go on that similar cost down trajectory, not just because of investment in the UK, but also because of there's a huge amount of global investment going into hydrogen production. So in terms of those two aspects, which are affordability and low carbon, that's really what we're shooting for. And I think we've got the sort of right building blocks in place to make sure that we get there.
David, anything to add? Good. To the floor, please. We have two gentlemen, Jason to the back.
Hi there, Douglas Dowell from the Russell Group of Universities. And obviously it's an area of great interest to a lot of our members, whether it's Glasgow working on hydrogen burners, Birmingham in the city on the hydrogen trains, or hydrogen storage at Exeter. I wanted to check one area, which obviously is important to all of this, which is the research and development side of things, which enables a lot of this to happen, both to make things more efficient and viable and working on how to make it all happen in the first place. And I wanted what you think we can do to help make that case effectively. There's been a good commitment from government to this at a time when that hasn't been easy, and we know it's not been easy. What can we do to help make that carry on?
Thank you. And just ahead.
Thank you.
Oliver Lancaster from the Institution of Gas Engineers and Managers. The government are doing a lot on the economy-wide work with hydrogen, but in the outside world, is hydrogen being judged too much on a silo sector-by-sector view? And is it not being looked at enough in the co-benefits that there are from demands sharing infrastructure, such as around industrial clusters, where there's about 40% of gas-connected homes and 40% of HGV registrations?
Excellent. Folks, Angie?
Yeah, I mean, So on the university and academic research point first, I think government have put in place quite a lot of pots of money that can help accelerate some of the key questions around hydrogen, whether it be fuel cell development or innovative heating systems or production technologies. And I sit on the board of IDRIC as well, so there's chances to do that. But I think, and I, from a Cadent point of view, with that hat on, really welcome thoughts and ideas from academia, because not only is it important to drive innovation all the time, and when I talk about the hydrogen village, we'll have 2 years of having a place on hydrogen, like what's not to want to get involved in that from an R&D point of view. So really keen, to collaborate from an industry academic point of view. I think it's absolutely crucial. And then on Ollie's point about have we been siloed? I mean, I will agree with you. I think we have, but I think what government has done is focus on the thing that needs fixing first, that will create the most scale, which is industrial decarbonisation with hydrogen. But then what we need to do next is use that as a catalyst to make all the other uses and demand sectors for hydrogen happen, which will be less expensive because of that. But at the minute, it's still on that sort of siloed approach. So I do think we need to help sort of spin off, if you like, from those clusters where you're people talk about the Swiss Army knife and hydrogen does everything and it can't possibly do that. But actually it can. It does a lot of these things. So let's not limit it too much.
I guess just to build a little bit on what Angie said on both of those things, I think what we want in the UK is not just to be a leader in technology deployment, but also a leader in technology development. And I think in the past we've perhaps got that one a little bit wrong. We've been a real leader in technology deployment in offshore wind, for example, and yet if you look where the tech is being manufactured, it's across the water in Denmark for the most part. So we don't want to make that same mistake in hydrogen, and that's where a lot of this investment in UK tech, in R&D, in innovation is really important. And so I think we need to be able to effectively communicate that message, to effectively communicate the size of the prize that there is in the sort of hydrogen space, to make sure that we're getting more funding flowing into these areas. I think that's really important. And again, just to, I guess, on Ollie's point, just to echo what Angie said, hydrogen, there is a case to be made for hydrogen when you look at a particular use case for the most part. But actually, hydrogen becomes the most compelling when you actually zoom out and look at it from an energy system perspective. So we need to be trying to do that. And I think We've struggled with that a little bit in Hydrogen UK as well. We try and break things down and then put them back together and try and work out how all of these things interlink. And I think it's where some of these sort of cluster projects can become really interesting, because you can start to get those different end use cases in the same areas using the same infrastructure, feeding off the same production. So you're not just having a one-to-one relationship, but you're having a 1 to 10, 20, 30 different kinds of off-takers. And so we're working. It's not easy. We're working on it, and I think we're getting better at it. But it's absolutely important that we don't just end up in our own little silos, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I just say that I think the perception of hydrogen actually isn't that it's that siloed. I think it's very much seen as part of a system. Whenever you see it's been discussed, it's generally as part of the cluster, to do with industry, to do with transport. So actually, I don't feel that. My perception of it is that certainly the government doesn't see it as something that's a siloed product.
How can we support universities in this role?
I think, interestingly, universities, there are some incredible universities doing a lot of work in this space, and it would always be great to have more. I would contend that actually the issue is more commercialising some of that research into a commercial product and then scaling it, which is difficult because irrespective of the direction of travel we currently have with government, it is not clear, and there is a lack of certainty to industry about the direction of travel. So there is a lot of pent-up energy, and where there are large-scale competitions going on around the East Coast cluster and HyNet in particular, they're going to get away because actually there seems to be, we're very close to having that model put in place to be able to get those over the line. But if you're talking about much wider rollout, then industry needs more certainty. I mean, the default you have with hydrogen, and my starting point was, why wouldn't you, and this is a very kind of, I suppose, naive starting point, but my starting point was, well, why wouldn't you convert all of the gas grid to hydrogen? Because actually, as you get large-scale production, you get more renewables, you generate hydrogen through electrolyzers or potentially even waste heat from nuclear, and there's all sorts of different things out there that can do it. You do it when it's cheap, you store it, and then, it goes into the gas grid when people need it. Now, when you actually break that down, the volumes you would require to completely decarbonise the gas grid and put everything 100% hydrogen, despite the fact that I think finally there's a recognition from government because of work being done by Cadent and Northern Gas Networks and ourselves in Teesside through a project, we're actually pumping hydrogen through an existing grid. You can actually do that. The issue is, where do you get the volumes from? And it's the economics of taking cheap electricity, ideally formed through nuclear or offshore wind or some other clean variant, and then in effect reconvert it and turn it into hydrogen, use that as an energy vector when you could just go straight to electricity. Now, what's interesting here is that it looks to me like where the government are kind of getting themselves to is in industrial clusters. That makes perfect sense, right? So you have more distributed networks, but it's not necessarily going to be one size fits all. So you probably don't end up completely turning the natural gas grid into hydrogen, but you might in places like Teesside. But then what does that mean in how it connects in elsewhere and other areas that are off-grid, like decarbonised LPG and others, that there's some interesting stuff coming along. But the bigger picture we need for all of this, and okay, the pilots are great, and there'll be another announcement tomorrow on the hydrogen transport hub where people can bid in to do pilots and test new technologies. That's all great. But fundamentally, what industry wants is certainty. I think, what's the actual direction of travel? And I think for too long now, and the government are going to have to basically, I don't want to use the term, but basically need to go in a direction of travel, because what the government have done is they've kind of allowed the system to develop slowly by creating all these little pots, because they want to keep it going. But by doing that, what government has is an excuse not to make a decision, because it's like, oh, well, we'll run another competition and we'll do a little bit over here, and if we put 20 million quid into that, it'll be great. And that's fine for a period of time. But when you build expectation on hydrogen, which we have done very successfully in the UK, and there are lots of private sector partners that have done that, not just the government, at some point you've got to make a decision about direction of travel. And you are seeing elsewhere in the world that's already happening. I mean, the US has been talked about. I mean, the money coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is poorly named but interesting in its delivery, huge amounts of money going into carbon capture, hydrogen now. I was visiting Houston just a few weeks ago, and they are going hell for leather for this stuff. And they're going to overtake us very, very quickly if we don't get our act together. The European Union are doing the same thing. I mean, billions and billions of pounds being attributed to this. And it's going to end up, if we're not careful, like offshore wind, like EVs, where you know, we might be the recipient of some of this technology, but we're not building that expertise that leads to the clusters, that leads to the IP, the spin-outs, the R&D that then grows and grows and grows. So all of that is extremely important, but all of that comes down to, which we all need to just get through to government more and more clearly, is give us certainty. You know, give us some long-term certainty. And that's where actually the energy bill will start to do that, because it gives us, you know, a funding model, a levy, a carbon pricing. It gives us a model that the private sector can deliver. It knows the state of play, whereas at the minute, it's fine up until about 2025, but you're not going to invest hundreds of millions, if not billions of pounds in a project if your regulatory and funding horizon is 2025, and that needs to be solidified pretty quickly, because we are literally on the cusp of this. I mean, again, just the Teesside angle, net zero Teesside, large-scale decarbonised gas plant with carbon capture on the side of it. You know, we want to start breaking ground in Q1 of next year, but the energy bill needs to be, you know, pushed through. We need to get it through to be able to do that, because yes, they're spending huge amounts of money at risk, but at some point they're going to be committing $3, $4, $5 billion into it. They're only going to do that through a very, very certain framework that needs to be set out by the government, and quickly.
Claire, to close up remarks here, you know, what do we need to see from this government to make sure that we can achieve some of these large-scale investments beyond 2025? We have 2 years left in this mandate. We have an election coming up after that. What can we achieve in the meantime that's going to help your members and prospective investors commit to the UK and keep us competitive with the US and other jurisdictions?
First, I'd just like to say a massive amen to what Ben just said.
Yeah, me too.
If we can get that on record and broadcast around the arena today, that would be lovely.
It's definitely on record. It's definitely on record.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly it. I mean, that's where there's a huge amount of uncertainty around. There's a lot of things in that energy bill which are absolutely critical to kick-starting hydrogen. And so I think that has to be the sort of key take-home message, that go home and tell all your friends. We need to get that energy bill through. We need the hydrogen business models. We need the mechanisms to be able to sort of fund these hydrogen villages. We need to get things kick-started. And I think if we can do that, then we are in a really, really strong position to emerge as one of the global leaders in this area. There will not be a single global leader. There will be a number of global leaders. There's a lot of it. Hydrogen's a very broad area, very broad energy system. There's a lot of different things going on. So, but it will be an opportunity for us to be one of those global leaders, which means jobs, it means economic growth, and it also means that we can actually deliver net zero affordably. So we need to sort of crack on and get on with it. But yeah, it's really exciting times to be working in the hydrogen space, so I'm very excited.
Thank you very much, Claire. Thank you very much to all our panelists today. I think it was a very informative discussion, and again, thank you to Hydrogen UK for your generous support to making this possible. Folks, thank you very much for attending us. We have some great policy exchange panels coming up ahead, and please join me in giving us a warm round of applause to our guests.